on January 23, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order creating a national reserve of Bitcoin. Many news outlets said it was a major step forward for cryptocurrency. Investors celebrated, and Bitcoin's price shot up to $100,000. Most people believed it was about supporting technological progress and showing leadership in digital finance. They were mistaken. This move was not really about crypto, it was about power. It was about economic warfare and using Bitcoin as a financial weapon, in the same way the United States has previously used the US dollar. China understood the message immediately. Within 3 days, the top leadership of the Chinese Communist Party held an emergency meeting. This group, made up of 7 of the most powerful leaders in China, oversees a nation of 1.4 billion people and the world's second-largest economy. They did not gather to discuss trade problems, Taiwan, or technology. They met specifically to discuss Bitcoin. To them, Trump's order was not simply a financial policy decision, it was a direct economic challenge to China. And now China is preparing to respond, not with speeches, but with real action. They are preparing to invest massive resources to compete for control of Bitcoin at the national level. This new race between the United States and China for dominance in digital assets will transform the global financial system and reshape the future of money. This struggle will decide which nation controls the future of global money, and the battle has already started. In the next few moments, I'll explain exactly what China is doing in response, the strategies they are putting in place right now, why they see President Trump's Bitcoin order as a serious threat, and how this financial conflict is likely to unfold over the next 3 years. This is not a theory or a prediction. It's happening right now, and most people are completely unaware. To understand why China views Trump's order as an act of economic warfare, it's important to understand what Bitcoin means on the world stage. Bitcoin is the first truly neutral form of money that no single country controls. No government can create more of it, no central bank can manipulate its supply, and no military force can seize it if it is properly protected. For 75 years, the United States has held financial power over much of the world by controlling the US dollar. The dollar has been the world's main reserve currency, used in about 70% of international trade, and nearly 60% of the world's central bank reserves are stored in dollars. This gives America huge influence. If a country wants to buy or sell oil or participate in global banking, they usually need dollars. And if the US government decides they don't approve of another nation's actions, they can cut that country off from the dollar-based financial system. This ability to restrict access to the global financial system has been used many times, through sanctions on Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, by freezing Afghanistan's dollar reserves, and by blocking countries from SWIFT, the International Payment Network. Every time the US uses its financial power in this way, other countries are reminded that they could lose their access to global trade if they anger Washington. Because of this, many nations have been searching for alternatives. For many years, China has been trying to increase global use of its currency, the yuan, hoping it could eventually compete with the dollar. But Bitcoin has now changed the equation entirely. China has tried for years to increase the global use of its currency, the yuan. They set up currency agreements with other countries and attempted to settle oil purchases in yuan. They pushed for the yuan to be included in the International Monetary Fund's special reserve basket. But even after all of that effort, it still only makes up about 2.7% of global reserves. The main reason is simple. Most nations do not trust China's government to allow the yuan to operate freely. The Communist Party tightly controls the currency, manipulates its value, limits the movement of money, and can change its worth overnight. Because of this, countries continue using the US dollar, Even though many dislike America's dominance, there just hasn't been a better alternative. Until Bitcoin. Bitcoin is different. It doesn't belong to any country. It has a fixed supply that cannot be changed, and no government or institution controls it. To China, Bitcoin looked like a possible way to escape US financial power without needing the world to trust China's financial system. If international trade could someday be settled in Bitcoin instead of dollars, America would lose its strongest economic weapon. This is why China allowed Bitcoin to grow for many years, even though it conflicts with their highly controlled system. They believed it could be strategically useful. At the same time, they understood the risk. If Bitcoin becomes a major global reserve asset, the country that owns the most of it will gain substantial influence, not total control like the dollar, but significant power. If the United States were to collect a massive amount of Bitcoin first, potentially over 1 million coins, Bitcoin could become just another tool of American dominance. That is how China interprets President Trump's executive order, as a signal that the United States plans to take control of Bitcoin and use it for strategic advantage, turning it into an American-controlled asset instead of a neutral global currency alternative. China cannot allow that outcome. If the US succeeds, China will lose twice, trapped in a dollar system they want to escape, and shut out of the Bitcoin system they hope could replace it. If the United States gains control of Bitcoin first, China would be trapped under American financial power for another generation. That is why President Trump's executive order forced China to act. They must respond, and they must compete to accumulate Bitcoin. They simply have no alternative. This is now a financial arms race, and it began the moment the order was signed. So what is China doing in response? Their strategy is unfolding on several fronts at the same time. The first area is Bitcoin mining. In 2021, China announced a ban on Bitcoin mining. Publicly, they said the ban was about reducing energy use and supporting environmental goals. But that explanation was only part of the story. The deeper reason was control. The government could not directly control privately owned mining operations within China, so they shut them down. As a result, many miners moved to countries like Kazakhstan, the United States, and Russia. China's share of global mining power dropped from about 75% to nearly zero within 6 months. However, what most people don't realize is that the ban was never absolute. Mining continued behind the scenes through state-linked organizations, including government-owned power companies and technology firms connected to the military. These operations took place in regions like Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Sichuan, especially during times of excess hydroelectric power. Because they used VPNs and foreign-registered mining pools, the activity did not appear to be coming from China. But large amounts of Bitcoin were quietly being mined and stored in wallets, controlled by the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force, the branch responsible for cyber operations. They manage China's Bitcoin the same way the US government manages its gold reserves. Estimates suggest China may have quietly mined between 50,000 and 150,000 Bitcoin since the ban. Trump's executive order changed everything. Within 1 week, China quietly removed limitations on state-controlled Bitcoin mining. They did not make a public announcement, but the shift is already underway. There was no public announcement about changing policy, but government officials in regions such as Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Qinghai received quiet instructions. State-owned power companies were told they can now direct extra electricity to Bitcoin mining operations. Approved government-backed organizations are now permitted to run mining facilities without punishment. The Chinese government is now using its enormous energy resources to mine Bitcoin on a massive scale. China produces more electricity than any country in history, around 28,000 terawatt-hours per year, more than the United States and India combined. Much of this energy comes from coal plants located in remote areas, where electricity cannot easily be sent to major cities. A lot of that power would normally go to waste, but it can be used to run Bitcoin mining machines. China is now shifting this unused electricity into mining efforts. They are building large mining centers in Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, and other Western regions, supported with government funding, free from regulatory hurdles, and powered by extremely cheap energy. China's goal is ambitious. They are aiming to control 20% to 30% of the world's Bitcoin mining capacity by the end of 2026. If they reach this target, they could mine around 140 Bitcoin per day, or roughly 51,000 Bitcoin each year. In just 3 years, China could add about 150,000 Bitcoin to its reserves. When combined with what they have already mined, they could control between 250,000 and 300,000 Bitcoin by 2028. This is their response to President Trump's goal of accumulating 1 million Bitcoin. China knows they can't reach 1 million, but they believe they can collect enough to stop the US from dominating the Bitcoin system and to ensure they remain a major financial power if Bitcoin becomes part of the global economy. The second part of China's strategy is buying Bitcoin directly on the open market. China currently holds about $3.2 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, the largest amount in the world. Most of it is held in US dollars and US Treasury bonds, assets they are increasingly trying to move away from. Over the past decade, China has reduced its Treasury holdings from about $1.3 trillion in 2013 to around $731 billion today. At the same time, they have been buying gold. In just the past 3 years, they added more than 1,000 tons of gold. Their official reserves stand at about 2,350 tons, but unofficial reserves held by government-controlled organizations and the military are believed to be more than 6,000 tons. However, gold has limits. It is physical, heavy, and difficult to transport. Bitcoin offers a faster, easier, and more flexible alternative, and that is why China is now preparing to buy it directly on the global market. Gold is difficult and expensive to transport, but Bitcoin is digital, borderless, and easy to move. It allows China to diversify its financial reserves without needing approval from the United States. After President Trump signed the executive order, Chinese state-linked investment groups began buying Bitcoin privately through what are known as over-the-counter (OTC) markets, rather than using public exchanges. OTC markets allow large purchases without causing the price to surge. These purchases are being made through intermediaries in places like Singapore, Hong Kong, and Switzerland, using shell companies, sovereign wealth fund connections, and state-controlled businesses operating through foreign branches. The People's Bank of China cannot officially buy Bitcoin yet, since doing so would require changing official reserve policies and publicly recognizing Bitcoin as a legitimate reserve asset. But organizations connected to the government can buy, and they are actively doing it. Current estimates suggest that China has already bought, or is in the process of buying, between 50,000 and 80,000 Bitcoin through OTC channels since late January 2025, at an average price of around $90,000 to $100,000 per coin. That equals roughly $5 to $8 billion, a small amount compared to China's $3.2 trillion in total reserves, but a major amount in the Bitcoin market. For perspective, 50,000 Bitcoin is more than the holdings of El Salvador and more than most publicly traded companies. And these purchases are increasing. Intelligence sources report that China has approved as much as $30 billion for Bitcoin acquisition over the next 3 years through government-linked entities. Depending on the price, that could result in $250,000 to 300,000 additional Bitcoin. When combined with mining efforts, China could control 500,000 Bitcoin or more by 2028, about half of America's 1 million Bitcoin goal. That would give China enough influence to ensure a major role in any future financial system built on Bitcoin. The third part of China's strategy is the development of the digital yuan. Since 2014, China has been building a central bank digital currency called the ECNY. It is the largest digital currency project in the world. More than 260 million people have already used digital yuan wallets, and over $100 billion worth of transactions have been processed through the system. China's goal with the digital yuan is to create a government-controlled digital currency that can compete with the US dollar in global trade. But the digital yuan faced a major problem. Almost no other country wanted to use it. Because the Chinese Communist Party controls it completely, they can freeze accounts, monitor every transaction, or reduce its value whenever they choose. It functions as a tool of surveillance, and for that reason, international adoption was extremely low. President Trump's Bitcoin order changed the situation. It gave China a new strategy. They are now promoting the digital yuan as being partially backed by Bitcoin. Not fully backed, but supported with enough Bitcoin reserves to give it credibility. The message is subtle but unmistakable. The digital yuan will be redeemable for Bitcoin at an official exchange rate set by China's central bank. This makes the currency more appealing than standard national currencies, which are backed only by government promises, while still allowing China to maintain control. This approach allows China to issue digital yuan, knowing it is supported by an asset like Bitcoin, an asset that is independent, limited in supply, and cannot be controlled by any nation. China can then offer other countries the ability to use the digital yuan for trade, with the guarantee that they can convert it to Bitcoin if necessary. This is a direct challenge to the US dollar. The dollar is not backed by gold or any physical asset. It is backed only by US power and control of the global financial system. If China offers a digital yuan backed by Bitcoin, many nations may find it more appealing, especially countries that have been targeted by US sanctions or want to reduce their dependence on the dollar. Nations like Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Pakistan, and many countries in Africa and Southeast Asia might adopt it for trade. As they do, the share of international transactions conducted in dollars would slowly decrease. China's plan is not to replace the dollar overnight, but to weaken it step by step. Every trade settled in digital yuan is a trade not using dollars. Every central bank that holds digital yuan reserves needs fewer dollar reserves. Over 10 to 20 years, this could dramatically shift the world's financial balance. Bitcoin backing is the key that makes this possible. This is why Trump's executive order forced China to act quickly. If the United States builds a massive Bitcoin reserve first and begins offering a Bitcoin-backed dollar or Bitcoin-backed government bond, China's long-term strategy collapses. And so, a global race has begun. The fourth part of China's response involves the BRICS alliance. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa recently expanded to include Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates. The BRICS countries now include Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the recently added Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates. Together, they represent about 45% of the world's population and roughly 35% of global economic output. For years, these nations have discussed ways to reduce their dependence on the US dollar. But they struggled to work together because they did not fully trust one another. Russia is wary of China, India is cautious of China, and Brazil tends to trust very few international partners. However, President Trump's Bitcoin executive order changed the situation. It created a shared concern among these countries. The possibility that the United States might use Bitcoin as a weapon of economic power, just as it has used the dollar. This fear pushed the BRICS nations toward cooperation. At the BRICS summit in Kazan, Russia, in October 2024, members spoke about creating a new shared currency or payment system. The details were unclear at the time, but after Trump's order, discussions moved much faster. China is now promoting the idea of a BRICS Bitcoin reserve, a shared pool where each member country contributes Bitcoin, managed by a joint international organization. It would function like the International Monetary Fund's special drawing rights system, but backed by Bitcoin instead of traditional government currencies. The structure is already being shaped. Contributions would be based on economic size. China would provide about 40%, India 15%, Russia 10%, and Brazil and the others would provide the rest. The total goal is between 500,000 and 1 million Bitcoin in the shared reserve. This pool would support trade between BRICS nations. For example, if Brazil sells soybeans to China, the payment could be made using BRICS currency units backed by Bitcoin, with no need for US dollars, no SWIFT network, and no American oversight. For the United States, this is a serious threat. It opens the possibility of a parallel financial system supported by real assets like Bitcoin and gold, allowing nearly half of the world to trade without touching the dollar. This won't happen quickly. It may take 5 to 10 years, but Trump's executive order made the shift almost unavoidable. By declaring that the US intended to dominate Bitcoin, America pushed other nations to unite to stop it. China is leading the movement, not out of generosity, but because a shared Bitcoin-backed system benefits them more than allowing the United States to control Bitcoin alone. And it benefits other BRICS members as well. Shared risk creates shared alliances. History has seen something similar before. In 1944, as World War II ended, the Allied powers met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new global financial system. Two different ideas were presented at the Bretton Woods meeting in 1944. The United States, represented by Harry Dexter White, had one plan. The United Kingdom, represented by economist John Maynard Keynes, had another. Keynes suggested creating a neutral global currency called the Bancor. It would be issued by an international central bank and backed by a mix of real commodities, including gold. Every country would use this currency to settle trade, and no single nation would have control over it. The goal was fairness and balance for everyone. White's American plan was far more straightforward. He proposed that the US dollar should become the world's main reserve currency, backed by gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. All other currencies would be tied to the dollar, meaning that indirectly they would also be tied to gold. In reality, the world would end up using the dollar for almost everything, giving America the advantage. Britain, exhausted and financially broken after the war, could not oppose the US. The Bretton Woods Agreement adopted the American plan, and the dollar officially became the global reserve currency. For almost 3 decades, the system worked well. But over time, the US began printing more dollars than it had gold to support. The Vietnam War and major government spending programs became extremely expensive, leading the US to create money that wasn't truly backed by gold. By 1971, other countries realized what was happening and demanded gold in exchange for their dollars. France, Britain, Switzerland, Germany, Japan, and others all lined up to convert dollars back into gold, and America's gold reserves began rapidly shrinking. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the ability to exchange dollars for gold. He said it was temporary, but more than 5 decades later, the change is still in place. From that moment on, the dollar became a pure fiat currency, meaning it was backed only by trust in the US government, not by gold or anything physical. This system has survived for more than 50 years because the United States remained the world's strongest military and economic power. But that power is weakening, and many countries are now searching for new options. Just like Keynes once proposed a neutral global currency, Bitcoin is now seen by many as a modern version of the banknote, a digital asset that no single country controls. This is why the rise of Bitcoin threatens the United States. If the world begins using Bitcoin as a reserve asset, the US loses the power that comes from controlling the global reserve currency. China understands this well. They studied what happened after Bretton Woods and watched how the US shaped the world for 80 years by controlling the financial system. China knows that simply trying to replace the US with its own currency, the yuan, will not work because the world would never accept a new single dominant power. Instead, they want a system where several major currencies coexist, supported by Bitcoin as a neutral foundation. Their goal is a multipolar financial world rather than a single country monopoly. This is why China is supporting the idea of BRICS countries holding shared Bitcoin reserves and exploring a digital version of the yuan backed by Bitcoin, rather than trying to force the yuan to become the world's only reserve currency. China has learned from history. When one nation tries to control everything, the rest of the world eventually pushes back. A shared, multilateral financial system creates more stability and cooperation. China thinks far ahead, planning for decades and even centuries, while the United States, especially under Trump's Bitcoin executive order, is focused on short-term moves leading up to the next election. This difference in strategy is why China may succeed in this currency battle, not by defeating America directly, but by building a new system that many countries prefer. Now, let's look at how this global currency conflict begins to unfold. In 2025, the first moves take place. President Trump signs the Bitcoin executive order in January. China responds by boosting Bitcoin mining and buying large amounts through private channels. Russia declares that it will accept Bitcoin as payment for oil and gas exports. Iran begins mining Bitcoin using excess natural gas that would otherwise be wasted. Saudi Arabia, balancing between American and Chinese influence, quietly begins accumulating Bitcoin through its sovereign wealth funds. India, wanting independence from both sides, builds its own separate national Bitcoin reserve. The situation becomes confusing for investors and governments alike. No one knows exactly who is buying how much. Bitcoin's price swings wildly, moving up and down between $80,000 and $150,000. By the end of the year, the United States holds about 150,000 Bitcoin through seizures and purchases, and China also holds about 150,000 through mining and market buying. Russia holds around 50,000, and BRICS nations together hold around 300,000. The race is evenly matched, but the trend is clear. Countries are now competing to accumulate Bitcoin. In 2026, everything speeds up. The United States increases its efforts. The Treasury begins buying Bitcoin directly in the open market, and the Federal Reserve creates a custody system for holding it. America buys another 250,000 Bitcoin. By the end of the year, the US controls about 400,000 Bitcoin. China responds by raising its share of global mining to 25% and buying another 150,000 coins through private trading networks. China now holds about 300,000 Bitcoin. At the same time, the BRICS Bitcoin reserve becomes official. Member countries contribute their share, and the collective reserve reaches 600,000 Bitcoin, with China indirectly influencing about 40% of it. Russia expands its energy-based mining operations and produces another 50,000 Bitcoin. Iran mines another 25,000. The Middle East begins accepting Bitcoin for oil, in small steps at first, starting with just 5%, increasing to 10% and reaching 15% by the end of 2026. This marks the beginning of a new system sometimes referred to as the petro-Bitcoin model. It directly challenges the petrodollar system that has supported American power since the 1970s. By 2027, the world reaches a breaking point. Bitcoin's price surges to around $300,000 because countries are buying aggressively. Everyday investors and even many institutions can no longer afford to buy in, and the price swings wildly. The United States announces that it now holds around 650,000 Bitcoin, getting closer to its goal of reaching 1 million. But at the same time, the US economy is struggling. The trade conflict with China has slowed growth, tax income is falling, and the government is borrowing around $5 trillion each year. Bond markets become unstable, and the Federal Reserve is forced to print more money to support government debt. The dollar starts to weaken. Seeing an opening, China makes a major move. They officially declare that the digital yuan is now partially backed by Bitcoin. Each digital yuan can be exchanged for a specific amount of Bitcoin at official rates. This is a powerful shift because it makes the digital yuan more secure than the dollar, which is backed only by trust in the US government. Countries that hold digital yuan reserves now gain indirect access to Bitcoin without needing to store it themselves. Adoption begins to grow quickly. Nations like Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and Pakistan, along with many African countries, begin using the digital yuan for trade with China. BRICS nations start settling trade using a shared BRICS currency unit backed by the collective Bitcoin reserve. Around 20% of global trade now takes place outside the dollar system. As a result, the dollar's share of global reserves falls from 58% to 50%. For the first time in 75 years, the dollar is no longer the clear majority reserve currency. The world becomes financially multipolar, with Bitcoin in the middle as a neutral, trusted asset. From 2028 onward, a new global financial system takes shape. Bitcoin stabilizes between $500,000 and $1 million per coin. Countries together hold more than 3 million Bitcoin, about 15% of all Bitcoin that will ever exist. The remaining supply is mostly owned by early believers, large companies, and individuals who refuse to sell. The world splits into two monetary systems. One is the Western system, based on the US dollar, US government bonds, and supported by allies such as Europe, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. The other is the Eastern system, built around BRICS trade, the Bitcoin-backed digital yuan, and a shared reserve controlled by countries like China, Russia, and Iran, along with nations choosing to stay independent. Both sides rely on Bitcoin as a reserve asset, but they do not trust each other, so Bitcoin becomes the neutral settlement layer between them. When the Western world trades with the Eastern world in this new global system, the final settlement is made in Bitcoin, not in US dollars and not in Chinese yuan. Bitcoin becomes the neutral asset that both sides trust. This shift represents a new version of the Bretton Woods Agreement, but instead of the dollar serving as the world's single reserve currency, Bitcoin becomes the shared reserve, and individual national currencies compete for everyday use. The system is chaotic and unpredictable, but it is more balanced than a world controlled by one dominant currency. This is exactly what China has wanted, not to replace the United States as the sole global power, but to create a system where China stands on equal footing. In this world, the dollar and the yuan both exist side by side, and Beijing holds as much influence as Washington. The currency conflict that began with Trump's Bitcoin executive order in 2025 does not end in a clear victory for either side. Instead, it ends in a stalemate, a multipolar financial world where Bitcoin is the ultimate reserve asset, and politics determines which national currency people use for daily transactions. In this scenario, some groups win and others lose. China comes out ahead. They break free from a world dominated by the dollar and successfully help build a shared financial structure where they hold meaningful influence. The yuan becomes a respected global currency, partly supported by Bitcoin and trusted internationally. They don't replace America, but they don't need to. Reaching equality is a win. Russia is also a winner. They use their energy resources to accumulate Bitcoin, making their reserves safe from Western sanctions. They can trade freely with China, Iran, and other partners using Bitcoin-backed systems, making old financial pressure tactics ineffective. Other BRICS countries like Brazil, India, and South Africa also benefit. They gain more control over their own financial systems and are no longer forced to operate under US financial rules. They trade using their own currencies supported by the shared BRICS Bitcoin reserve. Individuals who bought Bitcoin early and held onto it through years of uncertainty become extremely wealthy once Bitcoin reaches the $500,000 to $1 million range. They own the neutral asset that nations are competing to control. People who invested in both gold and Bitcoin also benefit. Gold rises to around $10,000 an ounce as central banks buy aggressively, while Bitcoin climbs dramatically. They protect their wealth during the transition to a new monetary system. In this new global financial system, the biggest loser is the United States government. It loses the complete control it once had over international money systems. The US dollar remains important, but it is no longer the unquestioned global leader. The power to use financial sanctions as a weapon becomes weaker. America can still enforce sanctions within its own alliance network, but countries operating in the new Eastern system can simply ignore them. This is a major shift in global power. People holding US dollars also lose significantly. During the transition, the dollar loses 30 to 40% of its purchasing power because of high inflation and the loss of reserve currency status. Anyone who held cash or US government bonds watched their wealth shrink dramatically. The European Union also struggles. They attempted to launch a digital euro, but it failed to gain global adoption. Europe ended up stuck between the American and Chinese systems, without strong influence in either direction. The euro becomes just a regional currency, rather than a global one. Small Bitcoin holders who sold too early also lose. Many people were excited to sell their Bitcoin at $50,000, thinking they had made a great profit, only to watch the price later rise to $1 million. They held the right asset, but they did not hold it long enough. Traditional investors also suffer. Stocks and bonds perform poorly during the transition. Inflation rises, global tensions increase, and a recession hits in 2027. The stock market stops growing, and real returns fall deeply negative. Many people lose decades of savings. So what can an ordinary person do? First, understand that this financial shift is happening whether you personally take part or not. The United States and China are in a major contest to control Bitcoin. Your individual Bitcoin holdings may not matter to them, but the results of this conflict will absolutely affect your financial future. Second, consider owning Bitcoin, not because one country will win, but because both sides are trying to accumulate it. When powerful nations compete to buy a limited asset, the price naturally rises. The move toward $1 million per Bitcoin is not just a guess. It is the mathematical result of massive demand meeting limited supply. Third, do not keep all your Bitcoin on exchanges. Governments will pressure exchanges for control and data. They may force identity tracking or even attempt seizure. The safest approach is self-custody, meaning holding your own private keys using a secure hardware wallet or cold storage. If you control your keys, neither China nor the United States can take your Bitcoin, even during financial conflict. Fourth, spread your assets across different countries. If you live in the United States, consider holding some of your Bitcoin through companies or accounts outside of the US, in places like Singapore or Switzerland, locations that do not automatically share financial information with the US government. If you are in China, try to secure Bitcoin outside the country through older Hong Kong accounts, overseas exchanges, or international custody services. Do not allow your government to control or restrict your access. Fifth, keep some gold as protection. Bitcoin is at the center of the global currency battle, but gold has always been the traditional financial safety asset. Central banks around the world are buying both. If Bitcoin ever faces technical problems or harsh regulations, gold becomes a backup store of value. A reasonable range is holding about 10 to 20% of your assets in gold, preferably stored outside the banking system. Sixth, prepare for major price swings. Currency conflicts create extreme volatility. Bitcoin could rise to 200,000, fall to 120,000, then climb to 350,000 and drop again. These moves will happen because governments will be buying, rules will be changing, and world events will impact markets. Do not panic. Do not try to time every move. Simply hold your position for the long term. Bitcoin's supply is limited, and demand from countries and large institutions will grow, which supports long-term price increases. 7. Watch for important global signals. If China announces that its digital yuan will be supported by Bitcoin, that would be a major turning point. If BRICS nations officially begin holding Bitcoin as reserves, that would also be a major shift. And if oil-producing countries start accepting Bitcoin as payment for energy, that would be the strongest sign yet. Each of these moments would move Bitcoin much higher. Pay attention to global news and understand the political and economic changes shaping the future, so you can position yourself wisely. To be clear, the recent Bitcoin executive order from President Trump was not just a national policy decision, it was an economic declaration of war. China recognized this instantly and responded with increased Bitcoin mining, government buying, the expansion of the digital yuan, Bitcoin-backed reserves, and BRICS coordination. This is the heart of the modern currency war. The United States and China fighting for control of the world's future financial system. The outcome is not yet decided, but the clash is unavoidable. Bitcoin is the battleground, and everyone who owns it is involved, whether they realize it or not. The timeline appears to be unfolding in stages. The early moves in 2025, rapid acceleration in 2026, crisis and turning point in 2027, and a new global financial system by 2028. The expected price target for Bitcoin is between $500,000 and $1 million per coin by 2028. This potential rise is not based on everyday investors or ETF buying. It is driven by governments competing for a limited asset. Bitcoin has a fixed supply that cannot be increased, while global demand is growing rapidly. When you understand this dynamic, the strategy becomes clear. Build your Bitcoin position while the price is still under $200,000. Store it securely in your own custody. Spread your holdings across safe international locations, and stay calm during price swings. This is a currency war, and it will continue until one financial system becomes dominant or both reach a balance. In either outcome, Bitcoin benefits. The only real question is whether you will hold long enough to experience the upside. If this message helped you see that Trump's Bitcoin executive order was not just about cryptocurrency policy, but a move in a major global power struggle, and if you now understand that China's response could reshape the entire world financial structure, then you are beginning to see the real situation. This is not about short-term price charts or technical analysis. This is about competition between nations, and that competition will shape the next decade. Subscribe to this channel because I will be covering every step of this monetary conflict. China's decisions, BRICS updates, and other key signals showing which side is gaining ground. You will watch the formation of a new global financial system as it happens and learn how to position your wealth accordingly. This is not financial advice. It is geopolitical insight. The currency war has already begun. Trump initiated it with his executive order. China is now preparing its counter move. Bitcoin is the central asset in this conflict. Position yourself wisely, because when this war ends and the new monetary system is established, you will either hold the asset that both sides fought to control, or you will be left holding the currency created by the losing side. The choice is yours.